Thank you, Bet, and to everybody at SATS. It's good to be with you again. I always look forward to connecting with your community, and I'm thankful for the ability to do that over the internet, over this technology we have that allows us to connect. One day I hope to visit South Africa and spend time locally there and learn about your country and culture. But for the time being, it's just a privilege to be with you on this day talking about Onesimus and Philemon. So there's going to be two parts to the lecture. The first part will be kind of a general orientation to the letter to Philemon. And then the second part will get into the main subject, which is on cruciformity. Does a cruciform theology work for both parties in the same way, Philemon and Onesimus? I always love to start out with resource recommendations because students and colleagues are always looking for the 2 or 3 or 4 things to get, to buy or to read that will help them better understand various New Testament topics, including Philemon. And so I'll recommend 4 things here. The first one is a collection of essays by African-American scholars called Onesimus, Our Brother. And the goal of this book is to think about, rethink this letter from an African-American interpretation perspective. There's a lot of things we kind of take for granted in this letter, and especially the kind of model of the irresponsible, lazy or stupid slave, which, kind of colonialist cultures tend to paint this picture of slaves as unintelligent, untrustworthy, and so forth. And because in America, African Americans, experienced slavery, there's this interest in rethinking some of those assumptions. It's an excellent collection of essays that makes you think about this from the perspective of reception history, interdisciplinary dynamics, and it's a short volume, very, very much worth reading. In terms of commentaries, we're lucky in the last about 30 years to have a number of standalone Philemon commentaries appear. Probably one of the bigger ones is by Scott McKnight in the NICNT series. And Scott, my colleague at Northern Seminary, does a good job of looking at ancient history, but also modern slavery. He's interested in historical critical dynamics and questions, and also literary and theological ones. He's interested in how we use this letter in ministry and personal formation. So it's a great comprehensive commentary. He has a big section on discussions in ancient slavery in classics and Greco-Roman scholarship. This is not a newer book, but highly recommended as John Barclay's little study guide to Colossians and Philemon. It's pretty short. But the section on Philemon, actually both parts of the book are excellent. But in relationship to Philemon, he asks a lot of great questions. He digs into issues of slavery that's very helpful, succinct. So if you're starting in scholarship in Philemon, that's a good place to start. It's not a new book, but it's kind of stood the test of time. And then if you want to get more into the theology of Philemon, I would probably say one of the best resources is Mary I. Thompson's Two Horizons commentary on Colossians and Philemon. She devotes a good long section to Philemon exegetically, but also theologically towards the end of the book. So that one is highly recommended as well. I'm just going to go through some basics of situation and background. I'm not going to dwell on this too long, but it'll help you get a sense for how I process the orientation of the book, some of those key questions of situation. In terms of who and where, we're talking about Philemon's household. Philemon was probably the main Christian leader, or at least one of the main Christian leaders of a household in the Lycus Valley somewhere. Colossae, perhaps Laodicea. There are 2 other people mentioned in the prescript of Philemon, Apphia and Archippus. They're both given descriptive terms like sister, Apphia, the sister, and Archippus, fellow soldier. And historically, scholars have wondered whether Apphia may be Philemon's wife, even though it isn't explicitly stated in the Greek text. And perhaps Archippus is a son of Philemon. More and more scholars are questioning that because kind of familial bond terminology is not used in a very clear way there. It could be just that these are other leaders of this household church, and they are kind of witnesses to what Paul is writing in the letter. We'll talk more about that later. We know that Paul is in prison. It's part of the captivity epistles. The traditional view is that he was in prison in Rome, but that's been called into question in recent years, mostly because of the distance between Rome and the Lycus Valley and other parts of Asia Minor. And so Ephesus makes more sense as kind of a major city that Paul's spent time in. The reason why Rome is often used is kind of tradition, the assumptions of imprisonments that are talked about in the book of Acts, but nothing in the letter to Philemon itself necessitates a Roman imprisonment. So with some of my colleagues like Mike Bird and others, John Byron, I'm leaning more and more towards the Ephesus theory because it makes sense of a much, much shorter travel to get from Ephesus to Laodicea, perhaps, or Colossae, than Rome itself. In terms of the situation, I mentioned John Barclay. He has this kind of saying at the beginning of his section on Philemon that I've always appreciated as a helpful reflection. He says, "The letter to Philemon is, to my mind, the most intriguing and beguiling of all Paul's letters, with its teasing historical allusions and its special rhetorical charms." Barclay has just such a great way with words, and it's true that when you read the letter to Philemon, it's not a complex letter. You kind of understand what's going on. This is about trying to reconcile a slave and a master. But when we actually try to figure out the situation, scholars are in pretty major disagreement. So I'm going to walk through 4 theories, situational theories, and then kind of talk through the kind of pros and cons, the benefits and drawbacks. Historically, traditionally, the most popular, the most well-known theory is called the fugitivist theory, or the runaway slave theory. So this theory says that Onesimus was a runaway slave, meaning he made a decision to leave the house of his master Philemon and run off permanently to find, freedom as a kind of escaped slave. We know that people in the ancient world, slaves sometimes did run away. In fact, we have an ancient non-fiction text called the slave catchers, which means people whose job was to catch runaway slaves. We know from a variety of sources that this was not an unknown or uncommon phenomenon. In fact, we have found kind of chains that go around the neck with a sign that says, "If you find my runaway slave, return him to me." And we imagine that these were sometimes put on runaway slaves who were found. And then they were kind of shamed with wearing this kind of collar. So the assumption there with the fugitivist theory is that Onesimus ran away from home, perhaps took some money or valuables to sell to kind of have some funding to make his escape and travel to a far off place. Normally what people did when they were in that situation as runaway slaves is they would try to go to a big city and kind of get lost in the crowd so that authorities could not easily find them. They would kind of stay hidden under, a false name, or they would join a runaway gang somewhere and try to survive in some kind of runaway slave community. If this theory is correct, then somehow Onesimus finds himself in the company of Paul. some people think that he was accidentally thrown in the same prison. Given how few Christians there were in the world at that time, that would be highly unlikely, no matter what city Paul was in, unless he was right there in Colossae or something like that. And then also the different social classes of Paul and Onesimus. Paul as a free person, as a Roman citizen, according to Book of Acts, and Onesimus as a slave. It's unlikely they would end up in the same prison cell, so to speak. But there may be other ways of explaining how they got together. And if they did, then he's converted in the faith, becomes a believer in Jesus, and then goes home to properly reconcile with Philemon. In the middle of the 20th century, scholars began to question the fugitivist theory, mostly because there's no concrete evidence in the letter itself that this is the most obvious situation. In fact, some scholars came up with a proposal that perhaps Philemon or someone else in his household or the church sent Onesimus intentionally to Paul, and there was some kind of relationship breach or mistrust that happens in the course of that. But I call this the delegate theory, that it is possible Onesimus was sent by the church to serve Paul in some way, and in the course of that, there's some matter that comes up, and Paul needs to send Onesimus home to make it right. A third theory, which has really grown in prominence in the last 25 years, 30 years, is called the amicus domini theory, or mediation theory. Amicus domini means friend of the master, amicus friend, domini master. And this is the idea that in the ancient world, in the Roman world, a slave that has some relational problem with their master might leave the house without permission, not to run away forever, but to seek out a mediator that's a friend of the master to act as kind of a broker, or as a conflict manager, to resolve the situation and to help curry some goodwill with the master who's been offended. The challenge here, this has really grown in popularity because there's some similarities between the letter to Philemon and a letter from Pliny to Sabianus that we found, where Pliny advocates on behalf of a former slave, a freedman, to the former master, Sabianus. There's some similarities in the rhetoric, and so this appears like it's possible that this is what was going on. The last theory is connected to a scholar named Peter Arch Grabner, and he argues that it matters what the motive is for leaving the household in terms of how a slave is punished for running away. If the slave has the intention of leaving the master, leaving the household, he should be punished more severely according to these ancient law scholars than if he's just kind of wandered off. So the arrow theory is the idea that he's really a incompetent or irresponsible slave who's just kind of lost track of time, or kind of maybe got lost on an errand. And so this is another possibility that he's a wandering slave. Right now, when we look at the commentaries that have come out in the last 20 years, I would say the amicus domini theory is the most represented theory. Scholars tend to not latch too hard onto one theory just because we don't have enough concrete evidence to say, yes, this is exactly what was happening. The fugitive theory is still expressed. It was first advocated in the patristic era. It was strongly supported by J.B. Lightfoot, and it still finds some advocates today. The delegate theory, it's only occasionally mentioned. I know David Powell talks about it in his commentary on Philemon. but it's not given a lot of interest and attention these days. But Amicus Domini, I tend to lean towards this one because it's able to explain how Onesimus made his way to Paul, that he sought him out intentionally, and wants his help in resolving some sort of situation. The arrow theory just kind of adds some color and nuance to some of the other theories, perhaps even the Amicus Domini one. We can definitely take questions and comments on the situation issue as we get to that time. In terms of a quick outline of Philemon, it's not a hard letter to read. You just open it up. It fits on a couple of pages of the Bible, and it flows pretty smoothly. It begins with a prescript. Paul mentions himself as a prisoner of Christ Jesus, the only time he actually references himself exactly in that way. He offers a salutation to not just Philemon, but Apphia and Archippus and the church that meets in their house. And so even though it's a personal letter, it has some elements of kind of more general text, something that the church was meant to hear, not just a personal one-on-one letter to Philemon. As normally the case, Paul gives a thanks to Philemon, especially for Philemon's spiritual gifts of love and community building. Paul talks about Philemon's ability in sharing his faith. And, koinonia is used here in pistis. Sharing of the faith doesn't mean evangelism. It doesn't mean talking to unbelievers. In this case, it refers to kind of the gifts that Philemon has in community building, community support, fellowship. And he really, I think, genuinely sees Philemon as a great leader of community. And he wants, looking kind of at what Paul wants, he wants Philemon to apply that to Onesimus as well, apply that love and generosity and warmth of fellowship. Starting with verse 8, Paul begins his appeal, and you think he's going to launch right into his appeal, and he kind of stops and takes a kind of digression to talk about the situation with Onesimus, saying he's become a Christian, and now he's this newfound brother. He's more than a slave, a beloved brother. Bruce Longenecker has mentioned an interesting theory that could explain why Paul refers to Onesimus as a brother here, not just a Christian brother, perhaps even a literal brother. Longenecker says it's possible that Onesimus is Philemon's biological half-brother, because we know sometimes a father of a household, a pater familias, might have sex with a female slave and produce a child. So let's say Philemon's father, had a child who is Philemon, but then had a child through a slave that is, the child is then Onesimus. And these are related. And it's, we do see this happening in the ancient world where you have half siblings grow up together in the household. One's a slave and one's not. And Longenecker wonders, could it be possible that Philemon's been treating Onesimus as only a slave for years, and now Paul is pressing him to say, okay, he could be more. He could be a beloved brother. It's possible, but the bigger picture is Paul wants Philemon to change his social orientation to Onesimus and to treat him as a peer rather than as a lowly slave, as a subservient. Starting with verse 17, Paul makes his actual appeal. So this is kind of the heart of the letter, verses 16 and 17. And the key word here is welcome. Welcome him. Welcome Onesimus as you would welcome me. Extend him warm reception and transfer any debt or wrongdoing to my account. So the heart of what Paul wants from Philemon is grace towards Onesimus, but also acceptance. Welcome is all about acceptance, hospitality. In essence, roll out the red carpet, treat him as you would treat me. Paul wants Philemon not to see people in different categories like blue collar, white collar, elite, commoner, slave, free. but on equal level as fellow brothers and sisters. Paul mentions at the end that he's going to come as well to visit and expects hospitality from Philemon. I think he's reminding him here, listen, what you normally do for me is you go above and beyond to make sure that I feel at home and cared for when I'm with you. And I think this is also a hint to Philemon. You need to do this for your slave Onesimus as well. And then he gives the normal final words of greeting and grace. I want to briefly mention the question of manumission because scholars over the years have wondered, why does Paul not explicitly tell Philemon to grant Onesimus his freedom? Why doesn't he just come out right out and say, when he comes home, you should manumit him, offer him his legal freedom? So scholars have tried to find ways to explain this. So these are three different views on the matter. Number one, a few scholars argue that Paul does expect Philemon to grant Onesimus his freedom. It's kind of assumed rather than stated. One piece of the puzzle is talked about by a scholar named Peter Head, who's in the UK. He makes an argument in a recent JTS, Journal of Theological Studies article, that Onesimus was the letter carrier. And as part of the duties of letter carrier, the letter itself might be more general, maybe ambiguous, and then the letter carrier would negotiate actual details of action points. And it's possible that Onesimus is the letter carrier, and then he's going to actually talk through what Paul's specific expectations are. That's one view. View number two, Paul nudges Philemon towards manumission. Paul does want Philemon to manumit Onesimus, but he doesn't want to coerce him. There's a scholar named Tim Brookins who wrote a really excellent article on the difference between the Roman conception, two different Roman conceptions of power, potestas and auctoritas. Auctoritas is rhetoric that is overpowering, where you're kind of forcing someone into submission. And potestas is a more warm-hearted appeal. So, if I want to get my students to do their homework, I could say, if you don't do your homework, then I'm going to punish you and you're going to get a bad grade. Or I could say to my students, you're really going to like this assignment. I think you're going to get interested in the books and the conversation that happens. So I highly encourage you to do this assignment. Brookins argues that Paul takes the more warm-hearted approach with Philemon as a way of having him discover the importance of this activity by himself and not be coerced into it. So that second view is that Paul wants it, but he wants Philemon to choose it. The third view is that Paul is actually not implicitly or explicitly calling for manumission. And Paul is more concerned with the life of the church and the social dynamics rather than legal separation. A few scholars explain this in different ways. Scott McKnight talks about how Paul was probably blind to the evils of slavery. Not that he was blind to the fact that slaves were mistreated. He knew that. But he didn't have in mind abolition. He didn't have in mind that slavery must go away as a whole institution. Perhaps he thought the end of the world was happening soon. And he thought the immediate need is for transformation of those relationships rather than trying to, for the bottom up rather than from the top down. There's another scholar named Cadwallader who argues that Paul didn't really want freedom for Onesimus, partly because you become a freedman and it's not really totally free. You're expected to be a client of your former master, and you had to work for them, and it was a kind of ongoing slavery. You kind of lose some of the benefits of slavery, like having a house over your head and meals. So Cadwallader said freedmen weren't necessarily free. They kind of lived in this strange in-between existence, and they didn't it wasn't just this blank check to live any way you want. And then he would leave the household and not really experience that reconciliation. John Barclay raises some of the complexities of wider household relationships. If Onesimus comes home and Philemon says, you're free to go, what happens to the other slaves in the household? Because we know that people like Philemon could have had 10 slaves, 20 slaves. We know that some elites had more than 500 slaves. And so this starts to raise questions about how Philemon would engage with other slaves and the conception of slavery in his world. My own view kind of changes from day to day, as it does with the situational theories, but I lean towards number 3 because if Paul wanted manumission, I think he would have said it. I think if that's a major piece of what he expected or wanted from Philemon, I think he would have said it. Take a look at letters like 1 Corinthians or Galatians. Paul's not shy about saying what he wants. So I don't think he would be shy here when it has to do with a person's life and their dignity and livelihood. So I think that third view is, to my mind, the most likely, even if it's kind of uncomfortable for us. I want to transition now to talking about cruciformity. This is a subject that I've been very interested for many years. I consider myself a friend and student from afar of Michael Gorman, who Bat has said is speaking to your community, which is a great blessing and privilege. This came up recently for me because I taught a course in the fall on the subject of cruciformity. I taught a course on Paul's theology and ethics, and we devoted 5-6 weeks of our weekly classes to the concept of cruciformity. We read through Mike Gorman's book, which I recommend all of you read, called Cruciformity. And cruciformity is all about living a cross-shaped life modeled on the obedience and way of Jesus Christ. And one of the big ideas behind cruciformity is the cross is not just the place where Jesus died, but Jesus's attitude as he goes to the cross and dies is a framework for Christian life. The term cruciform means the shape of the cross. And that's a kind of metaphor or synecdoche for living our lives in a cross-shaped way, that kind of take up your cross and follow Jesus sort of way. The reason that I decided to study cruciform Philemon, right now we're going to talk about cruciform Onesimus. Right now, we're going to talk about cruciform Philemon. But the reason I thought about this is I was teaching this lecture on cruciformity. I've taught it dozens and dozens of times over the years. I've taught it every year for over 10 years. And in the last couple of years, students have pushed back on this concept, finding it a problem for people who live on the margins and who experience disempowerment. So when I taught it back in the fall, I was expecting most students really like the idea. They find it attractive. They find it helpful for Christian theology. But this time, a couple of students were noticeably troubled by my teaching on cruciformity, the idea of humbling yourself, giving up your power, repudiating status, and humbling yourself. Some of these people found that problematic and even improper or unethical for people who live on the margins, who regularly experience disempowerment and oppression, marginalization. And so they raised, I think, a legitimate question. Is cruciformity healthy and good for the disempowered? And what's interesting is I'd never been asked that question as directly before. And so I hadn't really thought about it. I thought cruciformity is the Christian virtue, the heart of Christian ethics. And so I kind of panicked and I didn't know what to do. So I told the students, I'm going to think about this and I'm going to come back next week So I emailed Mike Gorman, Tim Gambas, who's written an excellent book on power and weakness in pastoral ministry, Rebecca Eklund, who does work in some of these areas, and Dennis Edwards, who I knew was writing a book on humility and how humility works for the marginalized. And so I sent them some of these questions from my students, especially what does cruciformity look like for an abused spouse? What does cruciformity look like for an ex-convict? What does cruciformity look like for someone kind of at the lowest economic level of society? And how do you avoid how do you find balance in that? And I was really appreciative of these colleagues sending me their thoughts. Many of them have been thinking about the same things. And I think the ultimate answer is cruciformity is not just the ethics of the privileged who have to give up their power. Some of my students and some chatter I've heard has said, okay, cruciformity is the ethic for people, with high status, but pursuit of justice, let's say, is the ethic for people on the margins. We're going to talk about justice, but I actually think that cruciformity is still the master virtue for all believers, no matter where you are on the scale of power and status. But this conversation with my students caused me to redefine cruciformity and to be clear about what it is and what it's not. And so we're going to spend the rest of our time talking about that. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because I know I've taken up a lot of time already. But I want to give you kind of an orientation to kind of those older conversations about cruciformity and what it is. So if cruciformity is this cross-shaped life modeled on Jesus Christ, it's associated with sacrifice and divestment and humility. So you take, someone who is, let's say, well, let's look at the master example from Gorman's work. Gorman points to the Christ hymn in Philippians chapter 2 as the kind of master story of cruciformity. He calls it a V-shaped pattern of the original glory of Christ, his humility and obedience to God, and his subsequent exaltation. And Gorman came up with a little formula that expresses this cruciform mindset, although X, not Y, but Z. So the although X refers to some kind of privilege. So in this case, it's though he was in the form of God. Y refers to avoiding exploitation or abuse of that power. Though he was equal to God, he did not consider that equality something to exploit. And then the kind of virtue or ethic, but he lowered himself and was crucified. And so X is privilege, Y is abuse of that privilege, and Z is some kind of divestment out of concern or love. So as we think about the situation with Philemon and Onesimus, Paul, we can assume, in this letter, calls Philemon to cruciformity. And I think we can assume in person he calls Onesimus to cruciformity as well. What does it look like for Philemon, the master? Although he's a master, he's called to not punish or domineer over Onesimus, even though that's his legal and cultural privilege, but to be conciliatory and gracious. And that means welcoming Onesimus back as a brother, integrating Onesimus into ministry work, maybe even leadership, and setting aside his biases against slaves. There's a scholar named Louis Brogdon who wrote an introduction to Philemon that argues that perhaps Philemon had kind of a discrimination against slaves. Obviously, we know that's possible. And that perhaps he wouldn't even let slaves participate in the church's fellowship and rituals and meals. And Paul is calling Philemon to account for that and saying, you need to humble yourself and accept all people, including slaves. And so what are the virtues that Paul would be calling Philemon to? Virtues like humility, grace, and sacrifice, the kind of typical virtues that we talk about when we talk about cruciformity. But as I mentioned, my students pushed me on this question. I actually ended up writing an article that's going to come out with Expository Times called Cruciform Onesimus. But my students raised the questions: how does cruciformity work and look for the marginalized and the powerless? What if you have nothing to give up? How do you avoid reinforcing unfair systems? Is cruciformity just and fair for everyone? And is cruciformity a passive dynamic? Is it just about rolling over and letting people walk all over you. And that is, as we know, is especially problematic for people that live without power, without equal power. And it can make cruciformity seem like the virtue of only the privileged. I had to shift as a result of this conversation, which only took place for me a few months ago. I had to shift my paradigm for cruciformity. I used to think that cruciformity was all about humility and sacrifice, giving things up. That's because I'm a privileged person. I have money. I have education. I live in a country where I experience a lot of privileges. And I didn't realize that cruciformity isn't good news for everybody. It isn't good news, humbling yourself and sacrificing and giving things up and giving up power, giving up status is not good news for everybody. And so I realized when I look back at Philippians 2 that the heart of cruciformity is all about not sacrifice or giving things up, but really about obedience to God at all costs. If we can choose our own way, our own selfish way, or we can choose what God wants. I think of the Garden of Gethsemane, not my will be done, but your will. That's what cruciformity is. It's not about one single expression or virtue, but it's really about the heart's orientation towards obedience to God at all costs, whatever we have to reject of our own selfish desires, and choosing to listen to God as Jesus does himself and models himself. So instead of thinking of cruciformity as a formula, although X, not Y, but Z, I talk about in my article cruciformity as a prism. A prism is this object with many sides. And so it's really not about following a script book, but really seeing how it's going to take shape and change from one situation to the next. Meaning cruciform Onesimus is going to look differently than cruciform Philemon, even though both of them are called to obedience to God, no matter what. So Scott McKnight, he likes the concept of cruciformity, but he rather talks of Christoformity, which is basically saying, what would Jesus do if he were in my situation, right? How do I conform to the person, the values, the virtues, the disposition, the mindset, the attitude of Christ, as we see in Philippians 2:5, where we have this mindset of Christ that's meant to be replicated in the believer. So I came up with 4 ways that I think about what cruciform Onesimus would look like as Onesimus is journeying back to Colossae, to Philemon's household. What is he carrying with him in terms of Paul's cruciformity charge or commission? And, for Philemon, it's not domination, but grace. I think it looks differently for Onesimus, and yet I still consider it cruciformity. So I came up with 4 dynamics. Number 1, obedience, not meekness. And so I'm imagining Onesimus going home to an unknown fate. And I wonder, did he second guess the plan of the journey to go back to Philemon's household? He could be killed. He could be beaten. He could be sent away to work on a farm, which was a way that masters sometimes got rid of a slave while still retaining their labor. And we know that farm slaves are often not ever given their freedom because they're out of sight, out of mind. So he could have experienced this sense of meekness that he wasn't going to confront Philemon on some of these issues. But cruciformity is crucifying that meekness and then leaning into courage and obedience. I think another dynamic of cruciformity for Onesimus would be love, not hate. I consider the engine of cruciformity love for the other. And Onesimus is called not just to love Philemon, but the whole community, which may include other slaves. Now, love doesn't mean letting people do whatever they want. Sometimes it looks like a confrontation or an intervention. Thirdly, the dynamic of, not this but that for Onesimus would be forgiveness, not revenge. You could imagine a scenario where Onesimus wants to take revenge. He's been empowered by Paul to come with a new task of kind of standing face to face on even level with Philemon. And he may have wanted to shame Philemon in front of the household, in front of Apphia and Archippus. He may have wanted to kind of dress him down and make him look bad. But Paul's message would be similar to what he says in Romans. Look to the Lord to judge. Our job is to obey. Leave vengeance to the one who judges justly. And on the opposite end, Romans 12 talks about love as actually showering gifts on the undeserving. And so I wonder, just as kind of a fun exercise, did Onesimus bring a present for Philemon? Kind of a hard thing for him to do, kind of the equivalent of a box of chocolates. What would it take for Philemon to have the mindset of loving forgiveness rather than wanting to exact revenge? Why do I think that way? Because if I were in Onesimus' shoes, I would want revenge for my slave master. I've been given a new empowerment by an apostle in chains, and it would give me a new opportunity to give someone who has something that's coming to them. And I think that Onesimus is being called to crucify that desire for revenge, to leave God as the great avenger, and to lean into practices of forgiveness. And then lastly, I think he's called to hope and not pessimism. I look at the situation with a sinner in 1st, 2 Corinthians that's talked about, who Paul told the community to admonish because they're committing sinful practices, and to hand them over to Satan, Paul says. And we learn from 2 Corinthians, they kind of went too far and they shunned this person and they kind of wrote them off. And Paul is saying, no, we need to restore the person. And it's easy in situations of conflict, especially major conflict, to lose hope and to have pessimism. And I think Paul is calling Onesimus to the difficult practice of hope, hoping that God can make right what's gone wrong. One of the pieces, I'm going to go quickly here because we're running out of time, but to summarize, the cruciform calling of Onesimus is not about divestment of power, but rather empowerment. And it's not about humility, but the virtue of the prism. Remember, the prism is this many-sided thing that's going to look differently from person to person, because the focus is obedience to God and disobeying our inner sinful desires, right? It's going to look differently. For some, it's going to look like humility, but for Onesimus, it's going to look like courage. But all things must be done in love of Christ and sinner and community. So cruciformity is really calling to ask, what would the crucified and risen Christ do? So I want to summarize. It means courageous obedience to God in confrontation with Philemon, love and forgiveness for Philemon driven by love and patience of God, and hope that God can do the impossible, even bringing a slave master together as brother and the Lord. The last thing I'll mention is the importance of community. When I had asked these colleagues, Gorman, Gombis, Eklund, and Edwards, how can we call the disempowered to cruciformity, to the risk and challenges of cruciformity? Many of them said the same thing independently. They said, we expect the community to keep each person safe. And so Philemon and Onesimus are not alone. The community ensures that reciprocity and fairness are observed. I think of the issue with the autochtoi, the unruly or idle in 2 Thessalonians, and Paul says, we need to keep these people in check. The community needs to keep these people in check. And so I think Paul is saying to Onesimus, perhaps in his fear of returning home, the community's got your back while you take a risk to reconcile and give. And Apphia and Archippus may be witnesses. So 1 minute here to summarize. My burden in that fall class with my students was to say cruciformity is still right and is still the heart of Christian ethics for everyone, for all believers, no matter where you fall on the scale of status and power. But I've changed my mind on, I don't want to be too specific about exactly what that looks like from person to person or situation to situation. As a person with money, as a person with education, myself, I have power, I have status. But as a person of color, as the youngest of my family of origin, right, some things like that, I experience less power. And so we understand what it looks like that our orientation towards cruciform behavior is going to change from situation to situation. I think that Paul called Philemon and Onesimus both to cruciformity because it's all about conforming to the love orientation of Jesus Christ in compassion towards humans and in full obedience towards God and in repudiation of our sinful desires. Thank you.